So now that the tower has been released for a good amount of time in Season 11 of Diablo 4, I wanted to go over not only what I think about the new introduction of the tower, but also what this means for the pit. Because I think a lot of people are kind of wrong or looking at this a bit backwards when it comes to both the tower and the pit, because right now with the tower just being in beta and having no rewards, it kind of just seems like a slightly different version of the pit with leaderboards and no rewards. But I think that's actually the intention of the tower, and as we go into the future with the pit is going to be the system that's going to be heavily changing. And I think we actually have some pretty good information on how the pit is going to be changing going into the future, with that meaning that it's going to be a lot more rewarding, a lot more varied, and it's probably just going to be a lot more crazy in terms of things that can actually happen in the pit. Now, if you're unaware of what the tower is a new introduction into Diablo 4. It's currently in a beta stage, so it's not technically a full release into Diablo 4, even though it is on the live game, and it is a pretty similar system to the pit. It just has a few differences and also has a leaderboard tied to it, and that leaderboard can be a bunch of different things. It could be different group sizes. There's a different leaderboard for every single one of the classes, and the leaderboard is going to be resetting, I think, every week right now, but at some point in the future it could be every week or every other week or something like that. Now, right now in beta, there's no rewards with this system, but at some point in the future when it's out of beta, there will be more cosmetically focused rewards, and more specifically, as you get higher and higher in the tower, you will get more and more one-time rewards. And then if you're somebody that's ranked highly on the leaderboards for whenever the tower resets, whether it be weekly or every 2 weeks or something like that, you will also be able to get additional rewards, including things like halos or other things that will be specific to that character. So let's say you get world first on one of the leaderboards for that reset period of the tower, you could maybe get like a really cool halo animation on your character, but that wouldn't be usable by other characters. It would only be on that singular character, and the content works a little bit differently. You're still trying to fill up a meter. There's a lot more pylons. There can be goblins that help with this. Elites drop these orbs you have to pick up to fill it even quicker, and then once it's filled up, the boss spawns and you kill the boss. If you ever play Diablo 3, you can kind of think of these like greater rifts, and then the pit would be basically normal rifts. And the main idea behind the tower, and the reason it was also launched in a beta stage, is because they want this system to be a much more competitive system. They want this to be the system that leaderboards are focused around, and they want you to be able to go test your builds against this and test your builds against other players, and it will be a much less reward focused system, or more specifically rewards within the game. For people who are really competitive, having that leaderboard type system is a reward in itself and competing with other players, but that is what the system is generally focused around. While they don't want it to just be a completely sanitized system where there's zero RNG, they also don't want to have the issues like you would have in Diablo 3 with greater rifts, where you're just essentially fishing for the best map to go into to actually try to get your good run. They don't want you to have to fish for different maps to try to actually get on the leaderboards, but they also want some amount of randomization, which is why I think they have things like different layouts and goblins and pylons within these runs. And while I do think the tower gameplay itself is actually pretty fun, I'm not someone who's actually super interested in the tower. I'll probably do it when there are those one-time cosmetic rewards just to be able to go and get those, but I'm much more interested in what the introduction of the tower is going to do to the pit, because the pit is actually going to be changing pretty heavily, because the tower will be taking its place in the most difficult endgame system where people go to test their builds against. Because developers have not wanted to change up the pit too much, because that's where you go to test builds. That's where you go for the most difficult endgame content. You test your builds against that. That's how a lot of the more online community kind of compares and tests all of the different builds of the different classes. Also probably a decent way for developers developers to have a good starting point for seeing the balance between all of the classes, because if a build from one class is doing a 125 pit and another class is only doing 90, they can kind of see that there's a big discrepancy there. But since a tower's coming in and can be much more for that, and actually even a bit more balanced around being specifically for that, the pit is just going to get pretty crazy. Now, we have had some comments from some developers talking about this specific thing, that this is kind of how they're thinking about it, that since the tower is taking over for the pit can get a lot more crazy. And they've just talked about changing it up, adding a lot more randomization into it, even adding things like the possibility of having just full goblin pits and just whatever crazy things they could think of, because again, the pit won't need to be that kind of tester for the endgame where endgame builds go to test themselves against. There will just be the tower for that now, so they're definitely going to be doing some crazy things with it. I think adding Belial as the seasonal mechanic into the pit in season 11 is kind of a small introduction into that, because while Belial of this season doesn't do a ton in the pit, I think it's actually made it better in some ways, having those eyes you could go focus on. You could group up enemies to stun them when popping the eyes. You could get Belial at the end to have a different boss fight, and while it gives different rewards, it also just changes up the gameplay of those actual pit runs. And I think they're going to continue to do that and just make the pit much more crazy and much more randomized. But we've actually gotten some really interesting information coming with the big endgame overhaul, coming with the second expansion, the Lord of Hatred, because we actually have a good amount of information on what's going to be happening to the pit based upon what's also going to be happening to the rest of the endgame. So first off, and one of the biggest parts of the new endgame overhaul coming with the next expansion is the introduction of war plans. Now, we don't exactly know how these are going to work, but they're being described as something that you go craft a war plan and then you choose a bunch of different pieces of content to create that war plan. And depending on what content you choose, and I'm presuming there's going to be some amount of randomization of the rewards with this, you then just go complete all of that content in that war plan. So in the small gameplay trailer we got of the expansion, this player chooses Infernal Hordes that has a loot bag symbol next to it as a reward. They choose Nightmare Dungeon with a ring or jewelry icon next to it. They choose Hell Tides with a jewelry icon next to it or gem fragments. They choose Whispers, which have a goblin icon next to it. Then they choose a layer boss with some icon that I don't recognize next to it. So you craft this war plan, you craft your path throughout the war plan, which they're calling basically creating a playlist. Then you go through that playlist and presumably there will be some amount of randomization with the rewards, and you'll probably be able to craft different war plans, and the different content will have different rewards. Now, it seems that every piece of loot focused endgame content will be part of the system, as we see in the visual in the gameplay trailer, including what looks to be the pit. So the pit will be part of this new warplane system, presumably with differences in rewards. So maybe in this run of the warplanes, maybe you could get a pit and it would have like all loot goblins as runs within that pit. So other rewards based upon getting that. And I do also think that this is another indication that the pit is going to be much more focused on being rewarding as well, because while the pit right now is very good, obviously, for leveling up your glyphs, which is actually massive power increases, it's not very good for anything else. Even in this season where we have Belial and you can kind of juice it up a little bit, it's not really good for anything. If you had all your glyphs to level 100, you probably wouldn't really run the pit anymore with the tower existing in its current form. So I think this is indicating that it's going to be much more rewarding with different rewards. But another piece of the endgame overhaul for this expansion is actually something that is massive and going to affect the pit pretty heavily. And that's that every piece of endgame content in Lord of Hatred is also getting its own skill tree, essentially getting its own meta progression. Now, I also have the assumption with these endgame skill trees that they will only be for systems that are loot focused. My assumption is that the tower will not only not be part of these endgame skill trees, but they probably also won't be in the warplane system. On this map, we see pretty much every piece of endgame content that will be in the expansion, and I don't think the tower is on this map, and it really wouldn't make sense for a system that doesn't have regular rewards to somehow be part of this endgame skill tree system. Really wouldn't make sense, because these endgame skill trees are probably going to be be almost fully focused around loot. And we do also know, based upon some previous surveys that have seemed to just give us information on this expansion months before it was released, and also some other information we have, it sounds like these skill trees are also going to allow us to get different loot from endgame content that we weren't able to get it from previously. One of the examples being able to get like upgrading materials or masterwork materials from, say, Hell Tides. So based upon all of that, pits being in this new warplane system, pits getting their own endgame skill tree, it seems like you will also be able to change the rewards you get from pit runs. So maybe as you do more pit runs through your warplanes or just doing them and you progress your pit skill tree, maybe you'll start to be able to have goblins that spawn in there that give more loot, or maybe you'll just enable pits to actually drop loot. Like maybe you'll enable a pit to be able to spawn goblins, and then at the end of the run you get a bunch of loot like a goblin would normally be dropping out of the chest at the end. Maybe you could go into a section where now running your pit also gives you masterwork materials, so you complete a pit run, you upgrade your glyph, the chest at the end opens, it spews out the random legendaries and uniques you would normally get, then also spews out a bunch of masterwork materials. Maybe you can get an upgrade that removes all the loot you would normally get and just gives you a ton of additional glyph experience. Maybe you massively lower the glyph experience, but it gives you a ton of other loot and you just completely juice up pits for other loot once you have like your glyphs fully leveled or something like that. So there's definitely a ton of different things that are going to be happening with the pit, in which I think is going to make the pit much more enjoyable, much more random, much more crazy things that can happen in it, and will just be much more rewarding with customization on what you can actually get out of it. And I think the best TLDR for the pit and for the tower is that the tower is going to be the non-rewarding thing you do to test your builds and compete against other players, and the pit is being turned into a very rewarding and more randomized end game system that is not going to be something that you're just using to test your build against. So I, for one, am actually pretty excited for this. The pit is something that I think is actually pretty enjoyable to run, but because it's so unrewarding outside of glyphs, it becomes pretty boring pretty quickly. But I think with more randomization and a lot more loot, I think the system will legitimately be one of the best parts of the endgame. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.